Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about the American literary eras. This year we're going to be reading literature that spans from the beginning and the founding of America to today. Now, each one of these pieces of literature fall into one of these particular literary eras. So each one of you guys is going to be completing a project on a topic related to one of these literary eras. It's either going to be from the Puritan Era, Romanticism. You might pick one of the two American masters, and I'll tell you more about that in a little while. Maybe you want to talk about the Realism Era, the Modern Era, or maybe even the Contemporary Era. So let's go ahead and get started on some of those project requirements. For this particular project, you are going to be discussing the people, the culture, and the literature of the time period, and you're going to select one specific author or poet that you can talk about. Now, you'll be provided an additional document that outlines specific information that you'll be looking for, but as we go through this presentation and I provide you an overview of each one of those literary eras, you'll want to be just concentrating on how some of this information relates to the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. The first literary era in the American landscape is the Puritan Era, and of course this was from the founding of America up through about the 1800s. Now, during this time period, we have of course the Puritans, or some people refer to them simply as the Pilgrims, but these people were a heavy influence in the type of literature that was first created in the American landscape. And of course, most, if not all, of the literature from this time period focused somehow on religion. Now, there were other factors during this time period that heavily influenced the literature. For example, the Native American culture. We're going to read some stories actually about the Native Americans and some by the Native Americans. In addition to that heavy influence, this was also the time of the Age of Reason. It was during this time period that science heavily influenced what was going on during this cultural period. And so we're going to read many documents that come from this Age of Reason or rationale. So you might want to select to do a project on the Puritan Era. Or for those of you who are particularly inclined to nature, you might want to select a project that concentrates on Romanticism. Now, the Romanticism era isn't necessarily what you would think as far as romantic love. The Romanticism era in the American heritage basically is that time period in which there's a lot of westward expansion and people are looking at the American landscape, literally, and they're romanticizing nature and all that goes into that. I mean, during this time period, we're actually expanding and learning more about our continent, and so it's a wonderful time period. Now, during this time period, there are many specific type of authors that you're going to read about. You're going to possibly read about the Transcendentalists, and many of you might be very interested in some of the Transcendentalists, or some of you might be interested in reading more about the Dark Romantics, and my guess is some of you have already read some information from the Dark Romantics like Edgar Allan Poe. So if you're interested in nature, if you're interested in dark, eerie kind of stories, you might want to concentrate on the Romanticism era. Now, sandwiched between the Romanticism era and the Realism era are the American masters. There are two poets that were directly responsible for poetry as we know it today in American history, and that's Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. So again, these two poets are kind of sandwiched in between two literary time periods, but they are an important part of the American literary landscape. So if you've heard of Emily Dickinson and you know you like her poetry, she might be the girl for you. Some of you might not ever have heard of Walt Whitman, but he's on a lot of Apple commercials, so even if you don't know who he is, you've probably heard his poetry before. So some of you might want to pick one of the two American masters. Now, there might be some war buffs out there, and so now that lends us to the Realism time period in the American literary landscape. Of course, this time period was heavily influenced by the Civil War, the break between the North and the South, and much of that was a result of slavery. So if you're interested in this part of American history, then you might want to read something from the Realism era, or you might want to focus your project on the Realism era. Again, it's going to deal with war pieces and pieces about courage, and then of course there are some slavery narratives built in there. So lots of interesting stuff if you're interested in that time period in American history. After the Realism Era, we're going to be reading some information from the time period termed the Moderns. Now, the Moderns was influenced by lots of things. Women's suffrage is one of those. Of course, during this time period, there was the stock market crash, which resulted in the Great Depression. We have World War I, lots of bootlegging going on, and that kind of coincides very nicely with the Jazz Age or the Harlem Renaissance. So if you're interested in music, or if you've heard anything about the Harlem Renaissance and you want to focus on that, then you might want to select something in the modern time period. One of the key elements of this time period is many immigrants had started coming to America to seek the American dream, but we find during this time period that the American dream is actually dead. And that heavily influenced a lot of literature during this time period, where you have people that are seeking to better themselves only to find out that there's no way that they're going to accomplish that. Now, the contemporary time period is our time period. What I find funny about this time period is it started in 1940 and it's still going on. So this covers a lot of landscape in the American literary heritage. During this time period, we're hearing from lots of different voices. I mean, we have authors, we have males and females and different ethnicities writing American literature. So lots of different voices incorporated here. And then there's the globalization. So we're going to have some literature that focuses on people who live to America or live in America and leave America, or that live in other countries and immigrate to America. Just all kinds of different globalization going on. And of course, this time period is heavily influenced by technology. So some of the pieces that we're going to read are kind of the eerie aspect of technology and how does it affect us as a culture. So to summarize, each student is going to be selecting one of these literary era pieces to do a project on, and again, additional information will be provided for you. You may select to do a project on the Puritan Era, the Romanticism Era. Maybe you're interested in Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman, so you might actually select to do your project on one of the American masters, the Realism Era, the Moderns, or the Contemporary. An additional project requirement sheet will be provided to you, but I encourage you guys to go back through the video from time to time and just look at those different pictures that represent the things that are going on during this time period to give you some ideas. And I look forward to seeing your projects.